In 1840, the Arizona Territory blazes under an unforgiving sun as cultures clash in the most brutal ways imaginable. At a dusty frontier trading post, a crowd gathers for what they believe will be just another routine auction of goods and livestock. But when the most feared Apache warrior in the territory, a giant named Aiyana, whose very name makes seasoned soldiers tremble, storms into the auction, demanding to buy a terrified 10-year-old girl, no one expects what unfolds next. What they witness isn't the savage brutality they've been told to fear, but something far more powerful that will shatter every assumption about enemies, family, and the true meaning of courage. This is the story of how one moment of unexpected compassion changed two lives forever, and how the bonds we choose can prove stronger than the ones we're born into. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the ramshackle trading post that served as the unofficial heart of Copper Creek, a settlement that existed purely because stubborn men refused to admit they'd built their dreams in hell. Dust swirled in lazy spirals around the weathered wooden buildings, and the air shimmered with heat waves that made everything beyond 50 yards look like a mirage. It was the kind of day when smart folks stayed indoors and waited for evening, but today was auction day, and in a place like Copper Creek, entertainment was scarce enough that people would endure just about anything for a break from the monotony. The crowd had been gathering since dawn, a motley collection of ranchers, drifters, traders, and townsfolk who'd come to bid on everything from cattle to cookware. Most wore the weathered look of people who'd learned to expect disappointment, but still showed up hoping for something different. The auctioneer, a thin man named Jeremiah Polk, with a voice that could cut through a thunderstorm, had already sold 3 horses, a wagon load of farming tools, and a collection of household goods that had belonged to a family who'd decided the territory wasn't for them after all. But as the morning wore on, an unusual tension began to settle over the crowd. Word had spread quickly through the small gathering about the final item up for bid, and it wasn't sitting well with anyone. Sarah McKinnon, a stern-faced woman who ran the general store with her husband, kept shaking her head and muttering under her breath. "Ain't right," she said to anyone who'd listen. "Just ain't right, no matter how you look at it." The source of the discomfort stood near the auction platform, trying to make herself as small as possible. Emma was 10 years old, though malnutrition and hard living had left her looking younger. Her auburn hair hung in tangled strands around a face that would have been pretty if not for the hollow look in her green eyes, and the way she flinched whenever someone moved too quickly near her. She wore a dress that had once been blue, but was now mostly the color of dust and neglect, and her bare feet were tough as leather from months without proper shoes. Emma's story was a familiar one in the territory, though that didn't make it any less heartbreaking. Her parents had been killed in a Comanche raid 6 months earlier while traveling through West Texas. She'd survived by hiding in a root cellar while her family's dreams burned above her head. A cavalry patrol had found her 3 days later, half dead from thirst and terror, and brought her to the territorial authorities. But with no relatives to claim her and no orphanage within 300 miles, Emma had become what officials coldly termed a ward of the territory, which, in practice, meant she'd been passed from one reluctant household to another, working for her keep until each family decided she was more trouble than she was worth. Now she stood in the dust beside a collection of farm equipment, another piece of property to be sold to the highest bidder. The legal papers in Jeremiah Polk's vest pocket described it as an indenture contract, which sounded more civilized than slavery, but amounted to the same thing. Whoever bought Emma's contract would own her labor until she turned 18, and in a place where the law was whatever the strongest man said it was, that could mean anything at all. "Next item," Polk called out, his voice carrying easily across the gathered crowd. "We have here a work contract for the girl Emma. No family name on record. Age approximately 10 years. Contract runs for 8 years of service. She's healthy, can cook basic meals, tends to livestock, and according to her papers, she's got some schooling, can read and cipher numbers better than most adults, I'm told." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Emma felt their eyes on her like a physical weight. She'd learned not to look up when people talked about her this way, but she couldn't shut out the voices. 8 aces a long time, called out Tom Bradley, a rancher who'd been eyeing her since the auction started. What's the guarantee she won't run off first chance she gets? Contract's legally binding, Polk replied smoothly. Territorial law requires return of runaways, and the penalty for harboring them is severe. Besides, where's a child gonna run to out here? This is civilized country compared to what's beyond the settlements. Emma's hands trembled slightly, but she kept them clasped in front of her and her eyes on the ground. She'd learned that showing fear or defiance only made things worse. Better to be invisible, to let them talk about her like she wasn't there, to hope that whoever bought her contract might at least feed her regularly and not work her to death. I'll start the bidding at $20, Polk announced. Remember, gentlemen, you're not just buying labor, you're getting someone who can already handle household duties and has years of work ahead of her. 25, Bradley called out without hesitation. 30, countered James Morrison, who owned a small ranch east of town and had been complaining about needing help with his livestock. Emma felt sick. She'd been through this process twice before, and it never got easier. The way they discussed her abilities and potential, like she was a horse or a piece of machinery, made her feel like she was disappearing, becoming less human with each bid. 35, came another voice, this one belonging to Walt Garrison, a man whose reputation for cruelty toward hired hands was well known throughout the territory. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably when he spoke up. The bidding continued, creeping upward in $5 increments. Emma tried to shut it out, tried to think about something else, but there was nowhere for her mind to go that didn't involve imagining what her life would be like under each potential owner. Bradley was rough, but fair from what she'd heard. Morrison drank too much, but wasn't violent. Garrison, though, she'd seen the way his current hired hands looked, and it made her stomach twist with fear. It was Garrison's voice she heard next, confident and slightly amused. $50, I think that should settle things. The crowd fell quiet. $50 was more money than most of them saw in 2 months, and Garrison's tone suggested he was prepared to go higher if necessary. Polk looked around the gathering, waiting to see if anyone else would challenge the bid. That's when they heard it. The sound came from beyond the edge of town, faint at first but growing steadily louder. It was the rhythmic beating of hooves, but not the random pattern of a horse being pushed hard across rough ground. This was different, controlled, purposeful, the sound of a rider who knew exactly where he was going and wasn't in any hurry to get there because he knew nothing would start without him. Conversations died mid-sentence. People turned toward the source of the sound, hands instinctively moving toward weapons they hoped they wouldn't need to use. In the Arizona Territory of 1840, an unannounced rider approaching at that particular pace could mean trouble of the worst kind. The horse that emerged from the heat shimmer was magnificent, a large pinto stallion with a coat that seemed to shift colors in the blazing sun. But it was the rider that made several people in the crowd take involuntary steps backward. He was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall, and built like a man who'd spent his entire life preparing for war. His shoulders were broad enough to block out the sun, and even sitting relaxed in his saddle, there was something about his posture that suggested coiled violence always ready to spring into action. His skin was the deep bronze color of someone who'd never spent a day indoors, and his black hair hung past his shoulders, held back from his face by a beaded leather band. He wore traditional Apache clothing, buckskin pants and shirt, decorated with intricate beadwork that probably represented victories in battle most of these settlers didn't want to think about. But it was his face that made grown men feel like children afraid of the dark. High cheekbones and a strong jaw gave him the kind of features that would have been handsome if not for the complete absence of anything resembling mercy in his expression. His eyes were dark as winter nights and just as cold, and they seemed to take in everything and everyone in a single sweep that missed nothing and forgave even less. This was Aiyana, whose name meant eternal blossom in his native tongue, but whom the white settlers knew only as the Apache, who never loses. He was a war chief of the Chiricahua band, a man who'd fought in more battles than anyone could count and had never been defeated. Army officers had nightmares about him. Territorial officials had put $1,000 bounty on his head, and he was sitting in their little trading post, like he owned the place, which, in every way that mattered, he probably did. The crowd stood frozen, unsure whether to run, fight, or simply wait to see what he wanted. Aiyana's horse moved forward at the same measured pace, hooves raising small clouds of dust that seemed louder than thunder in the sudden silence. When he finally stopped, it was directly in front of the auction platform, close enough that Emma could see the intricate beadwork on his shirt and smell the distinctive scent of leather and sage smoke that clung to his clothes. For a long moment, nobody moved. Aiyana sat perfectly still on his horse, those dark eyes scanning the crowd with the patience of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. When his gaze finally settled on Jeremiah Polk, the auctioneer visibly swallowed and took a half-step backward. "You sell the little one," Aiyana said, his voice carrying easily across the silent gathering. His English was precise, each word carefully chosen and clearly pronounced, which somehow made it more unsettling than if he'd struggled with the language. This was a man who'd taken the time to learn his enemy's tongue perfectly, and that suggested a level of intelligence and planning that made him infinitely more dangerous. Polk's mouth opened and closed a few times before any sound came out. We're conducting a legal auction here, territorial law and all." "I'm not sure you sell the little one," Aiyana repeated, and this time there was something in his tone that made it clear he wasn't asking a question or making a request. He was stating a fact about what was going to happen next. Walt Garrison, apparently deciding that his reputation required him to show some backbone, stepped forward. "Now hold on just a minute. I've got a legitimate bid on that girl's contract, and I don't care who you think you are." Aiyana turned to look at him, and Garrison's words died in his throat. The Apache war chief didn't say anything, didn't make any threatening gestures, didn't even change his expression. He simply looked at Garrison with those winter night eyes, and somehow that was more terrifying than any threat could have been. The silence stretched out until it became almost unbearable. Emma, forgotten in the drama unfolding around her, found herself looking up at the massive man on the horse. She'd been taught to fear Apaches above almost everything else, told stories about their savagery and cruelty that made her wake up screaming. But there was something about the way Aiyana sat his horse, something about the careful control in his voice that didn't match those stories. When he finally spoke again, it was still to Polk, and his words sent a shock through the entire gathering. "I buy her. Name your price." The auctioneer looked around desperately, as if hoping someone else would step in and handle this situation for him. But everyone else seemed just as stunned as he was. An Apache war chief wanting to buy a white child at auction wasn't something anyone had prepared for. The current bid is $50, Polk managed to stammer. Aiyana reached into a leather pouch at his side and pulled out a handful of gold coins that gleamed in the harsh sunlight. Even from where she stood, Emma could see there was more money in his palm than most of these people had ever seen at one time. 100, the Apache said simply, letting the coins catch the light. The crowd erupted. Voices rose in protest, confusion, and fear as people tried to make sense of what they were witnessing. Walt Garrison pushed forward again, his face red with anger, and something that might have been wounded pride. "You can't just ride in here and... This is a legal proceeding under territorial authority. You got no right." This time, Aiyana did more than just look. He swung down from his horse in one fluid motion that brought him to his full imposing height. Standing beside the platform, he towered over everyone present, and his physical presence seemed to fill the space around him like a gathering storm. "I have gold," he said, his voice still perfectly calm. "You want gold? This is how white man's law works. Yes, highest bidder wins." He placed the coins on the edge of the auction platform, where they made a sound like distant thunder as they settled against the wood. Emma had never seen so much money in one place, and from the expressions around her, neither had anyone else. Polk stared at the gold like it might bite him. The territorial authority requires that contracts for wards of the state be approved by... Why, who? Aiyana asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his tone. Your sheriff? Your judge? Your territorial governor? He gestured toward the surrounding desert. I see none of these men here. I see only you, and you want to sell, and I want to buy. This is business, yes? The logic was unassailable, and everyone present knew it. In frontier settlements like Copper Creek, the law was mostly theoretical anyway. People did what they could get away with, and right now, nobody was prepared to tell the most feared Apache warrior in the territory that his money wasn't good enough. Emma found herself holding her breath. She didn't understand what was happening or why this terrifying man wanted to buy her contract, but she knew with absolute certainty that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. Whether that change would be for better or worse remained to be seen. The standoff stretched on like a held breath, with Aiyana's gold coins gleaming on the auction platform and the crowd frozen in a tableau of confusion and fear. Emma could feel the tension crackling in the air like lightning before a storm, and she found herself studying the massive Apache warrior with a mixture of terror and fascination that she couldn't quite understand. Everything she'd been told about his people suggested she should be running or screaming or begging someone to save her. But something about the way he held himself, the careful control in his movements, made her think that maybe the stories weren't telling the whole truth. Jeremiah Polk wiped sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand, clearly wishing he was anywhere else in the world. As the official auctioneer, the decision was technically his to make, but the weight of that responsibility felt crushing under the circumstances. He glanced around the crowd one more time, hoping someone with more authority would step forward and take this burden off his shoulders. But the territorial judge was 60 miles away in Tucson, and the sheriff was chasing cattle rustlers somewhere in the mountain. He was on his own with a choice that could determine whether he lived to see another sunrise. The girl ain't even been properly examined by a physician, Walt Garrison said, desperation creeping into his voice as he realized his chance at acquiring Emma's contract was slipping away. How do we know she's healthy enough to be worth that kind of money? Could be she's got consumption or the wasting sickness or any number of ailments that would make her worthless as a worker. Aiyana turned those dark eyes on Garrison again, and this time there was something almost amused in his expression, as if he found the man's protests entertaining in the way a cat might find a mouse's struggles amusing before deciding whether to play with it some more or end the game entirely. You think I do not know healthy child when I see one? The Apache asked, his tone conversational but with an undertone that made several people in the crowd shift nervously. You think Apache cannot tell strong from weak, useful from useless? We who survive in desert that kills white men in 3 days without water. The implied insult hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire. Garrison's face turned an even deeper shade of red, but he seemed to realize that pushing this particular argument any further might not end well for him. Instead, he tried a different approach. It ain't natural, he said, appealing to the crowd now rather than addressing Aiyana directly. Apache buying white children at auction. We all know what that means. We all heard the stories about what they do to captives. A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathering, and Emma felt her stomach clench with renewed fear. She'd heard those stories too, whispered around campfires and told to frighten misbehaving children. Tales of torture and savage rituals of captives who disappeared into the desert and were never seen again. But as she looked up at Aiyana, she found herself wondering how much of those stories were true and how much were just fear talking. The Apache warrior listened to Garrison's words, without any change in his expression, but Emma noticed that his hands had moved slightly, settling near the knife at his belt in a gesture that looked casual but probably wasn't. When he spoke again, his voice was still calm, but there was something underneath it now that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. White man tells many stories about Apache, he said. Apache tells stories about white man too, Stories about families killed for land they never owned. Stories about children taken from mothers and sent far away to forget their names and their people. Stories about promises made and broken like dry sticks. He paused, letting his words sink in. Which stories are true and which are just fear talking? Perhaps that depends on who is telling them. The crowd fell silent again, uncomfortable with the implications of his words. These were people who'd come to the Arizona Territory looking for new opportunities and a fresh start, but most of them had done so by taking land that had belonged to someone else first. It was a reality they preferred not to think about too closely, and having it laid out so plainly by one of those someone else made them squirm like children caught in a lie. Sarah McKinnon, who'd been muttering disapprovingly since the auction began, finally found her voice. "What do you want with her?" she called out, her tone sharp with maternal protectiveness despite the fact that Emma was a stranger to her. Why would a warrior chief want to buy a white child? For the first time since he'd arrived, Aiyana's expression softened slightly, though it was such a subtle change that Emma wasn't sure anyone else noticed it. He looked down at her for a long moment, and she found herself meeting his gaze despite every instinct telling her to look away. His eyes weren't as cold as she'd first thought. There was something else there, something that looked almost like recognition, understanding. She couldn't put a name to it, but it made her feel less afraid than she had in months. "White people buy Apache children when they find them," Aiyana said finally, his attention returning to the crowd. "They say it is to civilize them, to save them from savage life. They send them to schools far away, teach them to forget their language, their customs, their families. They say this is kindness, this is rescue." He gestured toward Emma without looking away from the crowd. "This child has no family, no one to protect her. She will be sold to highest bidder, regardless. At least with Apache, she will learn to survive in a world that does not care about weak things." His words hit Emma like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were so completely, devastatingly true. She had been abandoned by the world of white settlers, passed from one unwilling caretaker to another, until she'd ended up here, standing in the dust while strangers argued over her future like she was livestock. At least Aiyana was being honest about it. Jeremiah Polk cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention back to the business at hand. The sun was climbing higher, and the heat was becoming unbearable. Several people in the crowd were already wilting, and he knew they wouldn't stand around much longer debating the philosophical implications of cultural differences. "The bid stands at $100 gold, he announced, his voice cracking slightly on the words. "Do I hear any other offers?" Walt Garrison looked around the crowd desperately, but nobody met his eyes. $100 was more than most of these people made in half a year, and even if they'd had that kind of money, the prospect of getting into a bidding war with an Apache war chief was about as appealing as sticking their hands into a rattlesnake den. "Going once," Polk called out, though his heart clearly wasn't in it. Emma found herself holding her breath again. In a few seconds, her fate would be decided, and she still had no idea whether she was about to be rescued or doomed. The uncertainty was almost worse than the fear. Going twice, Aiyana hadn't moved from his position beside the platform, but somehow his presence seemed to have grown even larger. Emma could feel the weight of his attention like sunlight through a magnifying glass, intense and focused and impossible to ignore. "Sold," Polk said finally, the word coming out like a sigh of resignation. "The contract goes to—" He paused, realizing he didn't actually know the Apache's name, and asking for it seemed like the kind of question that might not be welcomed. "Aiyana," the warrior said simply, "of the Chiricahua." He reached up and collected his gold coins from the platform, counting out exactly 100 and leaving the rest in his palm. The remaining coins disappeared back into his leather pouch, but not before everyone present got a good look at just how much wealth he was carrying. Polk fumbled with the official papers, hands shaking slightly as he filled in the required information. The whole process felt surreal, like something out of a fever dream rather than a legal transaction. When he was finished, he held out the documents toward Aiyana, who took them with the same careful precision he seemed to apply to everything else. "Contract is for 8 years, Polk said, apparently feeling obligated to explain the terms even though it was far too late for negotiation. "She's bound to service until age 18, or until the debt is paid in full, whichever comes first." Aiyana studied the papers for a moment, and Emma was struck by the realization that he could read English as well as speak it. The discovery shouldn't have surprised her, given how carefully he'd been handling this entire situation, but it drove home just how much planning and intelligence lay behind his actions. This wasn't some impulsive decision or random act of violence disguised as commerce. He'd come here with a specific purpose, and he'd achieved it with minimal fuss and maximum efficiency. 8 years, he repeated thoughtfully. Then he looked directly at Emma for the second time, and she felt that strange jolt of recognition again. Long time to learn what needs learning. Before anyone could ask what he meant by that cryptic statement, Aiyana folded the contract papers and tucked them inside his shirt. Then he turned and walked back to his horse, moving with the same fluid grace that had marked his earlier dismount. The crowd parted before him like water, nobody wanting to get too close but everybody unable to look away. Emma stood frozen beside the auction platform, unsure whether she was supposed to follow him or wait for further instructions. The whole situation felt unreal, like she was watching it happen to someone else rather than living it herself. Just that morning she'd been another unwanted burden being passed along to whoever was willing to take her. Now she apparently belonged to the most feared Apache warrior in the territory, and she had no idea what that meant for her future. Aiyana swung back up onto his horse with the same effortless motion he'd used to dismount, settling into the saddle like he'd been born there. Only then did he look back toward Emma, and she saw something in his expression that might have been impatience or might have been amusement at her confusion. "Come," he said simply. "Day grows hot, and we have long ride ahead." Emma took a tentative step forward, then stopped. "I don't have a horse." Several people in the crowd snorted with laughter at her obvious statement, but Aiyana's expression didn't change. He simply reached down and extended his hand toward her, palm up, in a gesture that was clearly an offer of assistance. Emma stared at his hand for a long moment, acutely aware that this was the point of no return. Once she took his hand and climbed up onto that horse, she would be leaving everything familiar behind and entering a world she knew nothing about. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to refuse, to run back into the crowd and hope someone else would take pity on her. But as she looked around at the faces surrounding her, she realized that safety and familiarity hadn't been working out very well for her lately. Walt Garrison was glaring at her with undisguised resentment, clearly blaming her for his failure to acquire her contract. Most of the other faces showed nothing but curiosity or indifference. These people had been perfectly willing to watch her sold to the highest bidder, without any concern for her welfare, and she doubted they'd be any more helpful if she changed her mind now. Sarah McKinnon caught her eye and gave her a small, encouraging nod. "Go on, child," she said quietly. "Sometimes the devil you don't know is better than the one you do." Emma took a deep breath and reached up to take Aiyana's hand. His grip was firm but gentle, and he lifted her up behind him with surprising ease. She'd never ridden double on a horse before, especially not bareback, and she grabbed onto his shirt instinctively to keep from sliding off. The leather was soft and warm from the sun, and she could feel the solid strength of the muscles underneath it. "Hold tight," Aiyana said over his shoulder. "My horse does not like to go slow." Before Emma could ask what he meant by that, he made a clicking sound with his tongue, and the pinto stallion surged into motion. Not the gentle walk she'd been expecting, but a ground-eating lope that carried them away from the trading post and into the desert beyond, at a pace that made her heart race with excitement despite her fear. Behind them, the crowd watched in stunned silence as the most feared Apache warrior in the Arizona territory rode away with a 10-year-old white girl clinging to his back. It would be a story they'd tell for years to come, growing more dramatic and unbelievable with each retelling, but none of the embellishments would capture the strange sense of rightness Emma felt as they disappeared into the heat shimmer of the desert afternoon. For the first time in months, she wasn't being passed along to someone who saw her as a burden or an inconvenience. She still didn't know what Aiyana wanted with her or what her future held, but at least she was moving towards something instead of just being moved around by forces beyond her control. And sometimes, she thought as the wind whipped through her tangled hair, that was enough. The desert stretched out before them like an ocean of sand and stone, vast and empty and beautiful in a way that took her breath away. She'd spent so much time in settlements and towns that she'd almost forgotten how big the world really was, how much space there was to simply exist without having to explain yourself or justify your presence to anyone else. As they rode deeper into Apache territory, leaving the familiar world of white settlements behind them, Emma felt something she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. For the first time since her parents' death, she felt like she might have a future worth living. The desert sun climbed higher as they rode, turning the air into a shimmering furnace that made Emma's eyes water and her throat burn with thirst. She'd never been this far from civilization before, and the vastness of the landscape was both terrifying and magnificent. Red rock formations jutted up from the sandy floor like ancient monuments, their surfaces carved by wind and rain into fantastic shapes that looked like sleeping giants or crouching beasts. Saguaro cacti stood like silent sentinels across the rolling hills, their arms raised toward the cloudless sky in permanent supplication to gods that seemed to have forgotten this harsh and beautiful land existed. Aiyana's horse moved through this wilderness with the confidence of an animal that knew every hidden spring and ass passage for miles in any direction. The stallion's hooves found purchase on loose rock and shifting sand with equal ease, never stumbling or hesitating even when the trail seemed to disappear entirely. Emma gradually relaxed her death grip on Aiyana's shirt as she realized that both horse and rider knew exactly where they were going, even if she couldn't see any landmarks or paths that would guide them. They'd been riding for nearly 2 hours when Aiyana finally slowed his mount to a walk and turned slightly in the saddle to look back at her. Emma was surprised to see something that might have been concern in his dark eyes as he took in her sun-flushed face and the way she was swaying slightly from heat exhaustion. "You need water," he said, and it wasn't a question. Without waiting for her response, he guided the horse toward a cluster of rocks that provided a small patch of shade in the endless expanse of sunlight. When they stopped, he swung down from the saddle with his usual fluid grace, and then reached up to help Emma down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground. The combination of heat, fear, and the unfamiliar motion of riding had left her feeling dizzy and weak, and she had to lean against a boulder to keep from falling. Aiyana watched her for a moment, then pulled a leather water bag from his saddle and offered it to her without comment. The water was warm and tasted faintly of the leather container, but it was the most wonderful thing Emma had ever experienced. She drank deeply, feeling the liquid wash away the dust and dryness that had been building in her throat for hours. When she finally lowered the bag, she found Aiyana studying her with that same unreadable expression he'd worn during the auction. "Better," he asked. Emma nodded, not trusting her voice. Now that they were alone in the desert, the reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. She was completely at this man's mercy, miles from any help, with no knowledge of where they were going or what he intended to do with her. The stories she'd heard about Apache captives came flooding back, and despite the kindness he'd shown in offering her water, she felt her fear returning in full force. Aiyana seemed to sense her growing panic, because his expression softened slightly and he moved a few steps away from her, settling down on a flat rock where he could watch both her and the surrounding desert for any signs of danger. "You are afraid," he said, and again it wasn't a question. Emma considered lying, but something about his direct gaze made deception seem both pointless and disrespectful. "Yes," she admitted quietly. "Good," Aiyana replied, surprising her. "Fear keeps you alive in places like this, but wrong kind of fear kills you just as dead as no fear at all. He gestured toward the vast expanse of desert surrounding them. You fear me because white people tell stories about Apache, but desert will kill you much faster than I will, and with much less mercy. Heat, cold, thirst, snakes, getting lost. These things do not care about color of your skin or which god you pray to. They kill everything equally. Emma absorbed this information, trying to understand what he was telling her. Are you going to kill me? The question hung in the air between them like heat shimmer. Aiyana was quiet for such a long time that Emma began to think he wasn't going to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she'd heard it before. I have killed many people, he said slowly. Soldiers who came to take our land, settlers who shot Apache children from hiding places, men who stole our horses, and women and thought we would not follow. He met her eyes directly, and she saw something in his gaze that looked almost like pain. But I have never killed child who did thee no harm. I have never killed anyone who was not trying to kill me or my people first. Then why did you buy me? Emma asked, the words coming out in a rush before she could stop them. What do you want with me? Aiyana was quiet again, this time staring out at the desert as if he could see something there that was invisible to her. When he finally turned back, there was something in his expression that she hadn't seen before, a kind of deep sadness that seemed to come from somewhere far inside him. 3 summers ago, he said slowly, cavalry soldiers came to our winter camp in the mountains. They said they were looking for raiders who had attacked wagon train, but they did not ask questions or look for evidence. They simply began shooting. His voice grew harder as he continued. My sister's daughter, Itzel, was playing with other children by the stream. She was 8 summers old. She had never seen white settlement, never hurt white person, never even spoken to white person. But soldier's bullet does not care about such things. Emma felt her breath catch in her throat. She'd heard stories about military raids on Apache camps, but they were always presented as necessary actions against savage enemies. Nobody had ever told her about 8-year-old girls playing by streams. Itzel died in my arms. Aiyana continued, his voice steady but his hands clenched into fists. She asked me why the white men wanted to hurt her when she had done nothing to them. I had no answer for her then, and I have no answer now. The silence stretched between them, heavy with grief and memory. Emma found herself crying without realizing it, tears sliding down her dusty cheeks as she imagined a little girl, not much younger than herself, dying for no reason other than being born into the wrong tribe at the wrong time in history. I am sorry, she whispered, meaning it with every fiber of her being. Aiyana looked at her with surprise, as if her compassion was unexpected. Why do you cry for Apache child you never knew? Because she was just a little girl, Emma said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Because it wasn't fair. Because nobody should have to die like that, especially not children. Something shifted in Aiyana's expression, a wall coming down that she hadn't even realized was there. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked at her not as a commodity he'd purchased or a burden he'd acquired, but as a person worthy of his attention and respect. You understand, he said quietly. Most white people hear that story and say, Itzel's death was sad but necessary, that Apache children grow up to be Apache warriors, so killing them prevents future conflict. They make excuses that let them sleep at night with clean consciences. That's horrible, Emma said, and she meant it. She was just a baby. Yes, Aiyana agreed. She was just a baby, and you are just a baby, standing in auction like sack of grain while men argue over your price. He paused, studying her face carefully. When I saw you there, trying to make yourself invisible while they discussed your future like you had no say in it, I saw Itzel, not because you look like her, but because you had same look in your eyes. Look of child who has learned that world is cruel place and that nobody will protect you if you cannot protect yourself. Emma felt fresh tears starting, but these were different somehow, not tears of sadness, but of something that might have been relief. For the first time in months, Someone was seeing her as more than just a problem to be solved or a mouth to be fed. Someone understood what it felt like to be small and helpless and completely at the mercy of forces beyond your control. "So why did you buy me?" she asked again. But this time the question came out gentler, more curious than afraid. Aiyana stood up and walked to the edge of their small patch of shade, staring out at the desert again. When he spoke, his words came slowly, as if he was still working through the thoughts himself. "I could not save Itzel," he said finally, "but perhaps I could save you. Not from Apache, as white people would think, but from same thing that killed her, from world that sees children as enemies, to be destroyed or property, to be owned instead of people to be protected, and taught and allowed to grow into who they are meant to be." Emma felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen for the first time in longer than she could remember. "You want to protect me. I want to teach you," Aiyana corrected. "Protection is temporary thing. Today I can keep you safe, but what about tomorrow, or next year, or when I am old and weak? Better to teach you to protect yourself, to survive in world that does not care about weak things." He turned back toward her, and she saw that the sadness in his eyes had been joined by something else. Determination, perhaps, or hope. In Apache way, strength comes not from being bigger or having more weapons than enemy. Strength comes from understanding yourself, understanding your environment, understanding how to use what you have instead of wishing for what you do not have. These lessons are same whether you are Apache child, learning to track deer, or white child, learning to survive in territory where law is what strongest man says it is. Emma nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "You're going to teach me to be strong. I am going to give you chance to teach yourself." Aiyana corrected again. "Strength cannot be given like gift. It must be earned, learned, chosen every day. But I can show you paths that others do not know, teach you skills that others do not have, help you see world in ways that others do not see it." The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying. Emma had spent so many months being shuffled from one place to another, always at the mercy of other people's decisions, that the idea of actually learning to take care of herself seemed almost too good to be true. "What if I can't learn?" she asked quietly. "What if I'm not strong enough or smart enough or brave enough?" Aiyana moved closer and knelt down so that he was at her eye level. When he spoke, his voice was gentler than she'd heard it yet. "Child, who survives parents' death, who endures months of being passed between strangers, who stands up at auction without crying or begging, who asks honest questions instead of pretty lies. This child is already stronger and smarter and braver than she knows. My job is not to make you into something you are not. My job is to help you become fully who you already are." Emma stared into his dark eyes and saw something there that she'd been afraid she'd never see again. Genuine care from an adult who wanted nothing from her except the chance to help her succeed. It was a gift so unexpected and precious that she felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of it. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for me?" Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally answered, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Because Itzel will never grow up to become the woman she was meant to be. Because her laughter will never ring through our camps again, and her children will never be born, and her songs will never be sung. Because death of innocent child diminishes everyone, whether that child is Apache or white or Mexican or any other color." He paused, looking out at the vast desert once more. "I cannot bring Itzel back, but perhaps, if I can help one other child find her strength and claim her place in world, some small part of what was lost can be recovered." Emma felt something shift deep inside her, a sense of purpose and possibility that she hadn't felt since before her parents died. She wasn't just being rescued or adopted or even saved. She was being given a chance to honor the memory of a little Apache girl she'd never met by becoming the strongest, most capable version of herself she could possibly be. "I want to learn," she said firmly. "I want to be strong." Aiyana smiled for the first time since she'd met him, and the transformation was remarkable. The stern, frightening war chief disappeared, replaced by someone who looked almost like a proud father watching his child take her first steps. "Good," he said simply. "Then we begin now. First lesson is about water in desert. Look around you and tell me what you see that might hold moisture even when everything else is dry." Emma stood up and began studying their surroundings with new eyes, no longer seeing just a harsh and barren landscape, but a classroom where her survival might one day depend on the lessons she learned. For the first time since her parents' death, she felt like she had a future worth working toward. The desert sun continued to blaze overhead, but somehow it no longer felt quite so oppressive. She had work to do. As the weeks passed, Emma discovered that life with the Chiricahua Apache was unlike anything she could have imagined. Aiyana's band made their camp in a hidden canyon deep in the Dragoon Mountains, a place so well concealed that even experienced trackers could pass within 100 yards of it without knowing it existed. The canyon walls rose like cathedral spires on either side of a narrow valley that contained everything necessary for life. Fresh water from a spring-fed stream, sheltered areas for sleeping, and natural defenses that made surprise attacks nearly impossible. The first thing Emma learned was that her preconceived notions about Apache life were almost entirely wrong. The savage, nomadic raiders described in settler stories bore little resemblance to the people she found herself living among. These were farmers as well as hunters, craftspeople as well as warriors, storytellers and healers and teachers who had built a complex society based on principles of mutual respect and shared responsibility that put many white communities to shame. Aiyana had introduced her to the band simply as Emma, who will learn our ways, and to her amazement, she was accepted without question or hostility. The children were curious about her pale skin and strange-colored hair, but their curiosity was friendly rather than fearful. The women took turns showing her how to prepare different foods, weave baskets and identify useful plants. The men taught her to read tracks, predict weather patterns, and move silently through terrain that seemed impossible to navigate. But it was Aiyana himself who became her primary teacher, and his lessons went far beyond simple survival skills. Every morning before dawn he would wake her and lead her to a different part of the canyon, where they would sit in silence as the sun rose, watching and listening to the world come alive around them. First rule of strength, he told her, on one such morning as they observed a family of roadrunners hunting for lizards among the rocks, is understanding that you are part of something larger than yourself. White man sees desert and thinks it is empty, hostile, thing to be conquered or avoided. Apache sees desert and knows it is alive, full of teachers and allies and resources for those who know how to look. Emma had been living with the band for almost a month when she experienced her first real test. She'd been gathering wild berries with some of the other children when a sudden thunderstorm rolled over the mountains, turning the usually dry creek bed into a raging torrent of muddy water that cut off their route back to camp. The other children seemed unconcerned, immediately beginning to look for an alternate path home. But Emma felt panic rising in her chest as she realized they might be stranded on the wrong side of the flood for hours or even days. "What do we do?" she asked. Naunish, a boy about her own age, who had appointed himself her unofficial guide to Apache childhood. "How do we get back?" Naunish looked at her with the patient expression she'd come to recognize as the Apache way of dealing with white people's tendency to panic in situations that had obvious solutions. "We find another way," he said. "Seed. Water goes down eventually. Until then, we wait, or we find different path." "But what if the water doesn't go down? What if we're stuck out here all night? What if there are predators, or storms, or—" "Emma," Naunish interrupted gently, using the tone adults used with frightened children. "You sound like white person now, seeing only dangers and problems. Try to sound like Apache person. Look around and see resources and opportunities." The rebuke stung. But Emma realized he was right. She was falling back into old patterns of thinking, seeing herself as helpless and dependent on others to solve problems for her. This was exactly the kind of thinking Aiyana had been trying to teach her to overcome. She took a deep breath and tried to look at their situation through Apache eyes. They were on high ground, safe from the flood. They had shelter under the overhanging rocks if the rain continued. They had water to drink and berries to eat. None of them were injured or in immediate danger. The flash flood would recede within a few hours at most, and even if it didn't, there were several other routes back to camp that would just take longer to travel. "You're right," she said to Nalnish. "I'm sorry, I was thinking like a settler instead of thinking like someone who belongs here." The boy smiled approvingly. "Better. Now what do you see that could help us?" Emma studied their surroundings more carefully, applying the lessons Aiyana had been teaching her about reading the landscape. "The flood is following the main channel, but there's a game trail along the ridge that would get us to the upper canyon. It's longer and steeper, but it stays well above the water level." "Good," Nalnish said. "What else?" "The storm is moving east, so the rain will stop soon. And look at how muddy the water is. That means it's carrying a lot of debris from upstream, which means it's moving fast and will go down quickly once the rain stops feeding it." "Very good. Anything else?" Emma thought harder, trying to see what she might be missing. Then she noticed something that made her smile. "The berries we gathered are still good. We can eat them while we wait, and we'll have something to share with the others when we get back to camp. So even being stuck out here turns into something useful." Nalnish nodded approving. "Now you sound like Apache. Problem becomes opportunity, obstacle becomes teacher, danger becomes chance to learn new skills." They ended up taking the ridge trail back to camp, arriving just as the sun was setting with their berry baskets intact, and a story to tell about their adventure. But more importantly, Emma felt something fundamental had shifted in her thinking. For the first time since joining the band, she hadn't seen herself as a burden or an outsider depending on others for protection. She'd been a contributing member of the group, someone capable of finding solutions and making decisions. Aiyana was waiting for them when they returned, and Emma could tell from his expression that he'd known about the flash flood and their alternate route home long before they'd figured it out themselves. This had been a test, she realized, and she'd passed it. "How was berry gathering?" he asked casually as she handed him a handful of the sweet purple fruit. "Educational," Emma replied, unconsciously echoing his own habit of using precise, thoughtful language. That night, as the band gathered around their central fire to share the evening meal and tell stories, Emma found herself really looking at the faces around her for the first time. These weren't the savage enemies she'd been taught to fear. They were families, parents and children, grandparents and cousins, people who laughed and argued and worried about their loved ones, just like any other community. There was Kuchais, the band's war leader, who was also a devoted grandfather, who spent hours teaching his grandson to carve hunting arrows. There was Ischan, a woman warrior, whose reputation for ferocity in battle was matched only by her skill as a healer and her gentle way with injured animals. There was old Nahail, whose stories could make children laugh until their sides ached, and whose knowledge of plant medicine had saved more lives than anyone could count. These were her people now, Emma realized with a start. Not because she was Apache by blood, but because they had chosen to accept her, and she had chosen to learn from them. Family, she was beginning to understand, wasn't just about who shared your appearance or your history. It was about who was willing to teach you and learn from you, who celebrated your successes and helped you through your failures, who saw your potential and encouraged you to reach for it. As the fire burned lower and the storytelling gave way to quiet conversation, Aiyana came to sit beside her on the smooth rock that had become her usual spot during evening gatherings. "You did well today," he said quietly, "not just with flood, but with thinking. I watched your face when you realized you were seeing problem like Apache instead of like frightened white child. That moment when understanding changes, it is a beautiful thing to witness." Emma felt a warm glow of pride at his words. Aiyana was sparing with his compliments, which made them all the more precious when they came. "I'm starting to understand what you meant about strength," she said. "It's not about being the biggest or the toughest. It's about being able to adapt, to see possibilities, instead of just problems." "Yes," Aiyana agreed, But you are learning something even more important than that. You are learning to see yourself as someone who belongs in world, someone who has right to take up space and make choices and contribute to community around her. This is gift that many people, even grown adults, never learn to give themselves. Emma considered this, thinking about the months she'd spent being passed from one household to another, always seeing herself as a burden, always trying to make herself smaller and more invisible to avoid being more trouble than she was worth. I never thought about it that way, she admitted. I always just tried to be grateful for whatever scraps of kindness people were willing to give me. Gratitude is a good thing, Aiyana said. But gratitude should not mean making yourself less than you are. When you make yourself small to avoid being burdened, you rob world of whatever gifts you might have offered. You rob yourself of chance to grow into person you were meant to become. As if to prove his point, young Nalnish appeared at Emma's elbow carrying a small carved wooden bird that he pressed into her hands with a shy smile. "Thank you for good thinking today," he said in his careful English. "You helped us find safe path home." Emma stared at the little carving in wonder. It was beautifully made, smooth and detailed, clearly the work of many hours of careful attention. But more than that, it was a gift given freely by someone who saw her as a friend and equal, not as a charity case or an object of pity. "Thank you," she whispered, meaning it more deeply than she'd ever meant anything in her life. As Nalnish scampered back to his family, Emma turned the wooden bird over in her hands, marveling at its craftsmanship and the kindness behind it. For the first time since her parents' death, she felt like she truly belonged somewhere. "He carved that himself," Aiyana said softly. "Took him 3 weeks to get it right. He has been waiting for right moment to give it to you." Emma felt tears pricking at her eyes, but they were good tears this time, tears of belonging and acceptance and hope for the future. "I want to learn to carve too," she said. "I want to be able to make beautiful things for people I care about." "Then you will learn," Aiyana replied simply. "Cochise is finest carver in band. I will ask him to teach you when you are ready." "When will I be ready?" Aiyana smiled in the firelight, and Emma saw something in his expression that looked like the pride a father might feel watching his daughter take her first independent steps into the world. "Soon," he said. "Very soon." As the evening wore on and the fire burned down to glowing coals, Emma found herself thinking about the strange journey that had brought her to this place. 6 months ago, she'd been a terrified orphan standing in the dust at a frontier auction, convinced that her life was over and that nothing good could ever happen to her again. Now she was sitting beside a warm fire, surrounded by people who cared about her, holding a gift made with love by a friend who valued her contributions to their shared adventures. The transformation seemed almost miraculous, but Emma was beginning to understand that it hadn't been magic that changed her circumstances. It had been choice. Aiyana's choice to see potential in a frightened child, her own choice to trust him and embrace the lessons he offered, and the band's choice to welcome her as one of their own. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to grow stronger and more capable. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Emma fell asleep feeling completely safe and utterly loved. In her dreams, she was running through the desert with Nalnish and the other children, laughing as they played games that taught them skills they would need as adults. In her dreams, she belonged exactly where she was, and that was the most wonderful dream of all. The seasons turned as Emma's education continued, each bringing new lessons and deeper understanding of the world she now called home. Summer blazed into autumn, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson that took her breath away every morning. When she emerged from the wickiup, she now shared with Ishjan, the woman warrior who had gradually taken on a motherly role in her life. Winter brought different challenges and different gifts. The necessity of conserving resources, the intimacy of longer nights spent around fires, sharing stories, and the profound silence of snow-covered desert that taught her to listen to sounds she'd never noticed before. By the time spring returned to the Dragoon Mountains, Emma had been with the Chiricahua for nearly a full year, and the changes in her were remarkable. The frightened waif, who had stood trembling at the auction in Copper Creek, had been replaced by a confident young woman whose skin had bronzed from constant exposure to sun and wind, whose body had grown strong and lean from climbing canyon walls and running mountain trails, and whose eyes held the kind of steady awareness that came from learning to see the world as it truly was, rather than as she wished it to be. Her Apache name was Nalnishbiyaji, which meant she who learns quickly, and it suited her perfectly. Under Aiyana's patient guidance, she had mastered skills that would have seemed impossible a year ago. She could track animals through terrain that left no visible sign to untrained eyes, predict weather changes by reading subtle shifts in wind and cloud patterns, and move through dense brush so quietly that even the sharp-eared deer didn't detect her presence. She spoke fluent Apache now, thinking in that language as naturally as she did in English, and had begun to understand the complex web of relationships and obligations that held Apache society together. But perhaps the most important change was invisible to casual observation. Emma had learned to trust herself, to believe that she had value and worth that didn't depend on other people's approval or charity. She contributed to the band's well-being through her own skills and efforts, and she was respected for her abilities rather than merely tolerated as a burden. The test of how complete her transformation had been came unexpectedly on a warm spring morning when a lone rider appeared on the canyon rim above their camp. The sentry's warning cry brought everyone to immediate alertness. Strangers approaching Apache camps usually meant trouble of one kind or another. Emma was helping Nahali gather medicinal plants when the alarm sounded, and she instinctively moved to a position where she could see the approaching visitor while remaining concealed herself. The rider was clearly white, wearing the kind of clothes that marked him as a settler or merchant rather than a soldier, but in Apache territory, the distinction might not matter much. Aiyana emerged from his wickiup and climbed swiftly to a vantage point where he could observe the stranger. After a few moments of careful study, he made a gesture that told the band to remain alert, but not to prepare for immediate attack. The rider was alone, appeared to be unarmed, except for a rifle that remained in its saddle scabbard, and was approaching slowly with his hands visible. All signs that he came in peace, or at least wanted to appear as if he did. When the stranger reached the canyon floor and rode into the camp proper, Emma got her first clear look at him and felt her heart skip with recognition. It was James Morrison, the rancher who had bid on her contract at the auction in Copper Creek. She remembered him as one of the less objectionable potential buyers, a man who drank too much but wasn't known for cruelty toward his workers. What was he doing here? And how had he found their hidden canyon? Morrison dismounted carefully, his movements slow and deliberate to avoid giving any impression of threat. He was dusty from long travel, and his horse showed signs of having been pushed hard over difficult terrain. Whatever had brought him here, it was urgent enough that he'd risked his life traveling alone through Apache territory to deliver his message. Aiyana descended from his watching post and approached the white man with the kind of controlled alertness that characterized all his interactions with potential enemies. He said nothing, simply waited for Morrison to explain his presence. Morrison cleared his throat nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but determined to go through with whatever mission had brought him here. "I'm looking for Emma," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent camp, "the girl who was sold at auction in Copper Creek last year. I've been told she's here." Emma felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Why would Morrison be looking for her? What could he possibly want after all this time? Aiyana's expression didn't change, but Emma could see the subtle shift in his posture that indicated he was now ready for violence if it became necessary. "Why do you seek her?" he asked, his English careful and precise as always. Morrison shifted uncomfortably under the weight of dozens of Apache eyes, studying his every movement. "Her situation has changed," he said. "There's been developments. She needs to know." "What development?" Aiyana pressed, and there was something in his tone that made it clear he wouldn't accept vague answers. Morrison looked around the camp, taking in the wickiups, the cooking fires, the children watching him with curious eyes, and the warriors whose hands never strayed far from their weapon. Emma could see him trying to reconcile what he was witnessing with the stories he'd been told about Apache savagery and the fate of white captives. Is she all right?" he asked, and Emma was surprised to hear genuine concern in his voice. "The girl, I mean. Is she being treated well?" For the first time since Morrison's arrival, something that might have been amusement flickered in Aiyana's dark eyes. "You travel 4 days through dangerous country to ask if Apache treats white child well. This is strange concern for man who wanted to buy her for farm labor." Morrison had the grace to look embarrassed. That was different. I needed help with my livestock, and she needed a home. It would have been a fair arrangement. But this, he gestured vaguely at the camp around them. This is not what anyone expected. Emma made a decision that surprised even herself. She stepped out from behind the rocks where she'd been concealing herself and walked into the open area where the two men faced each other. Morrison's eyes widened when he saw her, clearly struggling to reconcile the confident young woman approaching him with the terrified wife he remembered from the auction. "Hello, Mr. Morrison," she said calmly, speaking English but with the kind of measured cadence she'd learned from Aiyana. "You said my situation has changed. What did you mean?" Morrison stared at her in amazement, taking in her transformation. The ragged, malnourished child had been replaced by someone who moved with the fluid grace of a born desert dweller, whose skin glowed with health and whose eyes held the kind of quiet strength that came from knowing exactly who she was and where she belonged. "Emma," he said uncertainly, "is it really you?" "It is really me," she confirmed, "though I am not the same person you remember. Now, what news do you bring that was important enough to risk your life traveling here?" Morrison swallowed hard, clearly struggling with how to deliver whatever message he'd come to share. "There's been a lawyer in Copper Creek," he said finally. "From back east. Boston, I think. He's been asking questions about you, looking for records of what happened to you after your parents died." Emma felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What kind of lawyer?" "The kind that represents rich people," Morrison replied. "Turns out your mother had family back in Massachusetts that nobody knew about. Wealthy family. They've been looking for you since they heard about your parents' deaths, and they want you back." The words hit Emma like a physical blow, though she was careful not to let her reaction show on her face. She was dimly aware of Aiyana moving closer to her, his presence a steadying influence in a moment when her entire world suddenly felt like it was tilting off its axis. "They want me back," she repeated carefully. "They're your blood relatives," Morrison said, as if that explained everything. "Your mother's uncle is some kind of important businessman in Boston. He's got no children of his own, and he wants to bring you east, give you a proper education, make you his heir. The lawyer says you'd inherit everything when the old man dies. Businesses, properties, more money than you could spend in 3 lifetimes. Emma heard the words, but they seemed to be coming from very far away. A year ago, the news that she had family who wanted her, who could give her wealth and security and a place in civilized society, would have seemed like a miracle. Now it felt more like a death sentence. "And if I don't want to go?" she asked quietly. Morrison looked at her as if she'd asked why she didn't want to stop breathing. "Not want to go? Emma, we're talking about a fortune. A real life in a real city with real opportunities. You'd never have to worry about money or safety or having a roof over your head again." "I have those things now," Emma said simply. "You have?" Morrison trailed off, looking around the Apache camp with obvious disbelief. "Emma, you're living with savages in the middle of nowhere. This isn't a life. It is what?" Aiyana interrupted, his voice dangerously quiet. Morrison seemed to realize he'd wandered into treacherous territory. "I didn't mean any offense," he said quickly. "I just meant that a young white woman belongs with her own people, in civilization, not—" He gestured helplessly at their surroundings. Emma felt a flash of anger so pure and clean that it surprised her with its intensity. "These are my people," she said firmly. "This is my civilization. and I belong exactly where I am." The silence that followed her words seemed to stretch forever. Morrison stared at her as if she'd announced she was planning to sprout wings and fly to the moon. The Apache around them maintained their watchful quiet, but Emma could sense their approval of her declaration, like warmth from a fire. Finally, Morrison found his voice again. "The lawyer says the family has legal standing," he said desperately. "You're a minor, and they're your closest living relatives. They can force the issue if they have to." "Let them try," Aiyana said softly, and there was something in his tone that made Morrison take an involuntary step backward. But Emma raised a hand to forestall whatever Aiyana might have been planning to say or do next. This was her choice to make, her life to decide about, and she needed to handle it herself. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice steady and calm despite the turmoil in her heart, "I appreciate that you rode all this way to bring me this news, but I need you to understand something. The person those people in Boston are looking for doesn't exist anymore. The frightened little girl who was sold at auction in Copper Creek is gone. I am someone else now, someone who has found her place in the world and her purpose in life." "But the money," Morrison protested weakly. "The opportunities, the chance for a real future." Emma looked around the canyon that had become her home, at the people who had become her family, at the man who had saved her from despair and taught her to save herself. Then she looked back at Morrison with eyes that held no doubt whatsoever. "This is my real future," she said simply, "and no amount of money is worth giving it up." Morrison stared at her for a long moment, clearly struggling to understand how anyone could choose this life over the wealth and comfort being offered. Finally, he shook his head in defeat. "I'll tell the lawyer what you said," he promised. "But Emma, they're not going to just give up. This family has money and influence, and they're used to getting what they want. Then they will learn that some things cannot be bought," Aiyana said quietly, "and some people cannot be owned, no matter how much gold they offer." As Morrison mounted his horse and prepared to leave, he looked down at Emma one last time. "If you ever change your mind," he began. "I won't," Emma interrupted gently, but firmly. "But thank you for giving me the choice." After Morrison disappeared back up the canyon trail, Emma stood in the quiet camp surrounded by her chosen family, feeling the weight of the decision she'd just made settling into her bones. She'd turned down wealth, comfort and social position to stay with people the outside world considered savage enemies. By any conventional measure, it was the choice of a madwoman. But as Aiyana placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, and Ashton came forward to envelope her in a warm embrace, as Nalnish grinned at her, with obvious pride, and old Nahia nodded approval, from across the camp, Emma knew with absolute certainty that it was the sanest choice she'd ever made. She was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the people who understood her, living exactly the life she was meant to live, and no amount of Eastern money could buy anything more valuable than that. The weeks following Morrison's visit brought an undercurrent of tension to the canyon that Emma could feel like electricity before a storm. Though life continued its normal rhythm, children played their learning games, women gathered and prepared food, men hunted and crafted weapons. Everyone seemed more alert, more watchful. Sentries were posted at additional lookout points, and the usual coming and going between their band and other Apache groups slowed to a careful trickle. Aiyana said little about the threat posed by Emma's wealthy relatives, but she noticed that he spent more time studying the canyon's defensive positions, and that their daily lessons increasingly focused on skills that might be needed if they had to leave their home quickly and quietly. He taught her to pack essential supplies in bundles that could be grabbed at a moment's notice, to identify alternate routes out of the mountains, and to distinguish between the sounds made by different types of approaching riders, based on distance and terrain. "You think they'll come for me, don't you?" Emma asked one evening as they sat together watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson. Aiyana was quiet for a long time, staring out at the vast desert beyond their hidden refuge. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of hard experience. "Rich white men do not like to be told no," he said simply, especially when what they want is something they believe belongs to them by right of blood or law or custom. Your mother's family will see you as property that has been stolen from them, and they will not rest until they recover what they think is theirs. Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. Even though I don't want to go with what you want matters little to people who see you as child, who cannot make proper decisions for herself, Aiyana replied. They will tell themselves that you have been brainwashed by savage captors, that you do not understand what is best for you, that they are rescuing you from terrible fate, even if you resist. The truth of his words settled heavily between them. Emma had learned enough about the world beyond the canyon to understand that legal guardianship could be a weapon as powerful as any rifle, and that judges and lawyers and territorial officials would almost certainly side with wealthy Boston relatives over Apache warriors regardless of what Emma herself wanted. "So what do we do?" she asked. Aiyana turned to look at her directly, and she saw something in his eyes that might have been pride mixed with deep sadness. "We prepare for whatever comes, and we remember that strength is not always about fighting. Sometimes it is about enduring. Sometimes it is about choosing what to preserve, when you cannot preserve everything." His words proved prophetic just 2 weeks later, when the sentries brought word that a large party was approaching from the east. Too large to be a hunting party or traders, moving too purposefully to be casual travelers. When Aiyana climbed to the highest lookout point to observe them through the captured army field glasses he kept for such purposes, his expression grew grim. The feeling proved prophetic when runners arrived just after sunrise, with news that sent a shock through the entire camp. 3 Apache bands to the south had been attacked simultaneously by coordinated military forces, their camps destroyed, and their people scattered or killed. The survivors spoke of a new kind of warfare, not the clumsy pursuit of cavalry columns that Apache warriors had learned to evade with ease, but carefully planned strikes using Apache scouts to identify targets and Apache tactics to approach them undetected. Worse still, the attacks had been led by a man whose name sent chills through every Apache heart. Mickey Free, the half-Apache scout whose hatred for his own people had made him the most effective and ruthless hunter of his former kinsmen in the territory. Free had been captured as a child and raised by whites, but unlike Emma, he had embraced his captor's hatred of everything Apache, becoming more savage in his persecution of his birth people than any white soldier. "He knows our ways," Kokisi said grimly as the War Council gathered to discuss the threat. "He knows how we think, how we move, where we hide, and he uses that knowledge to help white soldiers kill Apache children." The debate that followed was heated and desperate. Some argued for immediate retaliation, striking back at military outposts before they could organize more attacks. Others wanted to retreat deeper into the mountains, abandoning their traditional territories for the dubious safety of more remote refuges. A few suggested trying to negotiate with territorial authorities, offering to remain peaceful in exchange for being left alone. Emma listened to the arguments with growing unease, understanding that none of the proposed solutions addressed the real problem. Mickey Free's success came not from superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but from his ability to think like an Apache while serving white interests. He could predict Apache responses because he understood Apache culture from the inside, and he could counter Apache strategies because he knew Apache traditions and limitations. "We're thinking about this wrong," she said finally, her voice goat through the increasingly heated debate. "Everyone is talking about how to fight Mickey Free or how to hide from him, but nobody is talking about how to beat him." The circle fell silent, all eyes turning toward her with the kind of attention that was both flattering and terrifying. These were seasoned warriors and wise leaders, people whose experience in warfare went back decades, and they were looking to her for answers she wasn't sure she possessed. "Explain," Aiyana said simply, and Emma recognized the tone he used when he wanted her to think through a problem completely before committing to a position. Emma took a breath, organizing her thoughts the way he'd taught her to do before speaking on important matters. "Mickey Free's advantage comes from understanding Apache culture," she said slowly. He knows that Apache bands will scatter when attacked, that they'll retreat to traditional hiding places, that they'll respond to provocation with predictable patterns of retaliation. He uses that knowledge to anticipate what we'll do and prepare counters for it. Nods around the circle indicated that people were following her reasoning so far. But his understanding is also his weakness, Emma continued. He knows old Apache ways, traditional Apache responses. He doesn't know how Apache thinking might change when it's influenced by someone who also understands white culture from the inside. Now she had their complete attention, and she could see comprehension beginning to dawn in several faces. "You want to fight him using white man's tactics," Cochise said, and there was something that might have been approval in his voice. "Not exactly," Emma replied. "I want to fight him using Apache tactics that have been modified by white understanding. Mickey Free thinks like an Apache who has been corrupted by white values. I think like an Apache who has been strengthened by white knowledge." The distinction was subtle but crucial, and Emma could see that the War Council was beginning to grasp its implications. "What do you propose?" asked Eston, the woman warrior who had become like a mother to Emma over the years. Emma had been working on this idea since the runners had first brought news of the attacks, but she'd hoped she would never need to voice it. Now, looking around the circle at the faces of people she loved more than life itself, she knew the time had come to risk everything on a strategy that could either save them all or destroy them completely. "I propose that we do something Mickey Free will never expect," she said quietly. "Something so contrary to traditional Apache behavior that he won't be able to predict it or prepare for it, which is—" Aiyana prompted, though something in his expression suggested he already knew what she was going to say. Emma met his eyes directly, drawing strength from the confidence she saw there, even as she prepared to voice the most dangerous plan she'd ever conceived. "I propose that instead of scattering, or hiding, or retaliating, we do the one thing no Apache band has ever done in the face of overwhelming military pressure," she said firmly. "I propose that we gather every Apache band in the territory together in one place and make a stand that will be remembered for generations." The silence that followed her words was so complete that Emma could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ear. What she was suggesting violated every principle of Apache warfare, every survival instinct that had kept her adopted people alive in a hostile world for centuries. But it was also, she believed, the only strategy that might actually work against an enemy who knew all the traditional responses and had prepared counters for every conventional Apache tactic. "You want to concentrate our forces instead of dispersing them," Cochise said slowly, working through the implications. "Make ourselves a larger target instead of hiding." "I want to make ourselves a target that's too big and too dangerous for Mickey Free to handle with conventional tactics," Emma corrected. "If every Apache band in the territory gathers in one defensible location, we become too large a force for small unit attacks to defeat. The military would have to commit massive resources to assault us, resources they don't have and can't afford to lose. And if they do commit those resources," Eston asked pointedly, "if they bring every soldier in the territory against us?" Emma smiled grimly, knowing this was the part of her plan that would either convince them or get her branded as a dangerous fool. "Then we give them exactly what Mickey Free has been promising them all along," she said. "One decisive battle that settles the Apache question permanently." The War Council erupted in voices raised in alarm, anger, and desperate questions. Emma held her ground calmly, waiting for the initial shock to wear off and for people to start thinking through the strategic implications. It was Aiyana who finally restored order with a sharp gesture for silence. When the circle was quiet again, he looked at Emma with an expression that was both proud and deeply concerned. "You are proposing to stake everything on a single engagement," he said carefully. "To risk not just our band, but every Apache band in the territory on one throw of the dice." "Yes," Emma admitted. "But consider the alternative. Mickey Free is systematically destroying us one band at a time, using our own tactics against us. If we continue responding in traditional ways, he'll eventually hunt down and kill every Apache in the territory. We're already losing this war. I'm just proposing that we choose how it ends." Cochise leaned forward, his scarred face intent with concentration. And you believe we can win this decisive battle? Emma chose her words carefully, knowing that overconfidence could be as dangerous as despair. I believe we can make it cost them more than they're willing to pay, she said honestly. Mickey Free has been successful because he's been fighting small groups of Apache, using predictable tactics in terrain he knows well. But fighting 1,000 Apache warriors who are prepared for siege warfare, who have chosen their ground carefully, and who are led by someone who understands white military thinking as well as Apache strategy, that's a very different proposition. The debate that followed lasted the rest of the day and well into the night. Every aspect of Emma's plan was examined, questioned, and argued over by people whose lives would depend on getting the details right. Gradually, though, a consensus began to emerge that her strategy, dangerous as it was, offered their best hope for survival in an increasingly impossible situation. The decision to implement Emma's plan was made just before dawn, as the eastern sky began to lighten with the promise of a new day. It would take weeks to gather the scattered Apache bands, weeks more to prepare defenses and stockpile supplies, and there was no guarantee that the military wouldn't attack before they were ready. But for the first time since the runners had brought news of Mickey Free's campaign, Emma saw hope rather than despair in the faces around her. They were going to make a stand worthy of the Apache name, and whatever happened, their children would know that their parents had faced their enemies with courage and dignity. As the war council dispersed and people began the urgent work of preparing for the most dangerous gamble in Apache history, Aiyana walked with Emma to their favorite overlook above the canyon floor. "Are you frightened?" he asked quietly, as they watched the sun rise over the desert that had been their home for so many years. Emma considered the question honestly before answering. "Terrified," she admitted, "but also excited. For the first time since I've been Apache, we're not just surviving or hiding or running away. We're choosing our own destiny, win or lose." Aiyana nodded slowly, understanding flooding his dark eye. "You have become everything I hoped you would when I first saw you standing at that auction," he said softly. "Strong enough to face any challenge, wise enough to see solutions that others miss, brave enough to risk everything for what you believe in." Emma felt tears prick at her eyes as she realized that she was looking at the man who had saved her life and shaped her into the person she'd become. Whatever happened in the coming battle, she owed him a debt that could never be fully repaid. "I learned from the best teacher in the world," she said simply. As they stood together watching the sun climb higher in the desert sky, both of them understood that their peaceful life in the hidden canyon was coming to an end. The next few months would test everything they'd built together, everything they'd learned from each other, everything they believed about themselves and their people. But they would face that test together, as family, as Apache, as people who had chosen their path with open eyes and would walk it to whatever end awaited them. The most important battle of Emma's life was about to begin, and she had never felt more ready for anything in her life. The battle came at dawn. 3 months later, every Apache band in the territory had answered the call, gathering in the fortress-like canyon Emma had chosen, a place where ancient stone walls channeled attackers into killing fields. Mickey Free arrived with 400 soldiers and territorial militia, confident he was about to claim his greatest victory. He was wrong. Emma's strategy worked perfectly. The concentrated Apache force, fighting from prepared positions with coordinated tactics that blended traditional Apache warfare with military knowledge, shattered Free's assault. The enemy retreated in chaos, leaving behind equipment, weapons, and the broken reputation of the most feared Apache hunter in the territory. But victory came at a terrible cost. Aiyana found Emma as the sun set on their triumph, his chest torn open by cavalry saber, blood seeping between his fingers. She knelt beside him in the red dust, cradling the head of the man who had saved her life and made her who she was. "Did we win?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We won," Emma said, tears streaming down her face. "Mickey Free is dead. The soldiers are retreating. The Apache will be left in peace." Aiyana smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something beautiful and serene. Good, then Itzel can rest. Her death has meaning now. Emma's throat closed with grief so profound she could barely breathe. Don't leave me, please. You're all I have. No, Aiyana said gently, reaching up to touch her cheek with a trembling hand. You have everything now: strength, wisdom, family, purpose. You are complete, Nalish Biagi. You do not need me anymore. But I love you, Emma sobbed, the words torn from her heart. You're my father, my teacher, my hero. How do I live without you? The same way I lived after Itzel died, Aiyana replied, his voice growing faint. By remembering that love never ends, it just changes form. Every time you help someone who is lost, every time you choose courage over fear, every time you stand up for what is right, I will be there with you. His hand fell from her face, his eyes closing peacefully. Tell my story, daughter. Tell them about the Apache who bought a frightened white child at auction and discovered that the greatest victory is not in battle, but in giving someone the chance to become who they were meant to be. Emma held him as the desert stars emerged overhead, understanding finally that some gifts are so precious they can only be repaid by passing them on to others. Aiyana had taught her to be strong, to belong, to love without conditions. Now it was her turn to teach those lessons to someone else. Through her tears, she whispered the promise that would define the rest of her life. I'll find another lost child, and I'll give them what you gave me. Your love will live forever. In the silence of the desert night, surrounded by the family he had helped her choose, Emma began planning how to honor the greatest gift anyone had ever given her, the gift of becoming herself.